Thank you. And thank you all for coming. We thought that I might begin by reading very briefly from Wonderlands. The essay that I'm going to read from is somewhat autobiographical. It's called All the Dark Nights. And it's mostly about the trials of being a young writer and some of the things that happened to me in my 30s. So I'll just read a few paragraphs from that essay to lead us off. Women and men who have decided to be fiction writers have a certain fanaticism. Sometimes this fanaticism is well concealed, but more often it isn't. You need it to get you through the bad times and the long apprenticeship. Learning any craft alters the conditions of your being. Poets, like mathematicians, ripen early, but fiction writers tend to take longer to get their world on paper because the world has to be observed in predatory detail, and because the subtleties of plot, setting, tone, and dialogue are difficult to master. Fanaticism ignores current conditions, such as the fact that you may be living in a garage, surviving on peanut butter sandwiches, and writing a great novel that no one so far has read or wants to, in the hope of some condition that may arrive at a certain point in the future. Fanaticism and dedication and doggedness and stubbornness are your angels. They keep the demon of discouragement at bay. But given the demands of the craft, it is no wonder that so many of its practitioners come out at the other end of the process as drunks, bullies, windbags, and assholes. The wonder is that any of them come out as decent human beings, but some do. A writer's life is tricky to sustain. The debased romanticism that is sometimes associated with it, the sordid glamour of living in an attic, the ketchup sandwiches, being a drunken oaf or a bully, getting into fistfights, needs to be discarded. And in the age of the internet, it probably has been. I'll read one other paragraph. It seems a shame to say so, but the hardest part of being a writer is learning how to survive the dark nights of the soul. There are many such nights, far too many, as you may discover. Part of the deal of having a soul at all includes the requirement that you go through several dark nights. No soul, no dark nights. But when they come, they have a surprisingly creepy power, and almost no one tells you how to deal with them. Psychologists have their name for this sort of feeling. They call it imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is endemic to the art of writing because gifts, the clear evidence of talent, are not so clearly associated with writing as they are with music and graphic art. Not everyone has perfect pitch. Not everyone can carry a tune. Not everyone can draw or create an interesting representation of something on canvas. But almost every goddamn moron can write prose. I'll stop there.
So thank you for reading that, Charlie. First of all, I want to say just how happy I am to be back with you. I realized recently that I now know you for more than half my lifetime. I mean, not quite half your lifetime, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
And I really love this book of essays, and I want to talk about a bunch of things. And I'd like us to have a conversation which people can listen in on, and then occasionally I may turn to the audience and ask you to explain something for those who haven't already read the book. But I want to first talk with you about that essay that you read from, which is really about writerly insecurity. And I love that essay for a number of reasons. First of all, just on a personal level, I remember when I was in your workshop at Michigan, you always talked about these 3 novels that were in a drawer somewhere.
4.
4. Even better. And I'm not sure you made this explicit, though you might have, but I definitely got the sense at the time, and I found this very encouraging, that you didn't regret those novels. I mean, I think you may have been happy that they weren't ultimately published, but you didn't feel like they were a waste of time. You felt like they were really an important part of your writing process. You weren't dismissive of your having written them. They were what you wrote at that time. Is that an accurate?
Right. It is accurate. I did not, I was not in an MFA program. I had gotten an academic PhD instead. And so in a sense, I felt as if I had to teach myself how to write fiction. And because the kind of criticism that I was writing was mostly theoretical in nature, there was a way in which I had to retool my brain. I was very much under the influence in those days of people like Donald Barthelme and John Barth and Gaddis and writers like that. And I tried to write like that. And it was a long apprenticeship because I found that I really didn't have a gift for that kind of writing. And I had to learn what my subject was. And in doing so, I found that the writing that I had wanted to do was not good, and I had to want to do another kind of writing. And it took me 4 novels to learn that.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that I really love about this essay is that it's not the kind of essay that you think it is at the start, or at least not the kind of essay that I thought it might be at the start. You know, there's I remember when I was an MFA student of yours, there was an essay in Harper's, I think it was by Richard Ford, but if not, it was someone like him. That was essentially an essay about, you know, I struggled for years, everyone rejected my work. And then what goes unstated in the essay is, well, but now I've done really well. Yeah. And being a young and insecure writer, I kind of found that essay annoying because, you know, I mean, they wouldn't ask someone who had never published anything ever to publish an essay in Harper's. And so, you know, there can be essays that are like, yeah, that are sort of implicitly arrogant by referring to the lean days. But I felt that this essay was in some ways really the opposite. I mean, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I read this essay was that you're basically saying, you know, yes, I've had some measure of success, but the imposter syndrome does not go away. I still feel it. It doesn't go away for most writers, maybe even any writer. And that in a weird way, it's not so different once you've published than it is from before you published.
Right. I think the problem for many writers is exacerbated whenever the ego is in charge. And because the ego is so constantly hungry and always wants more of whatever it's been given. And when you're a young writer, you want to be published. Then you're published, and you want to get good reviews. If you get some good reviews, maybe there have been a few that haven't been good, and the ego is deflated again. Then there's sales. Maybe you're not going to have the kinds of sales you want. And I think this is a kind of spiritual problem that writers in the short term and in the long term simply have to find a way of dealing with. And for me, the lesson is simply one of humility. And I don't want to sound self-righteous about this. I just want to say that in order to keep going, you have to be happy with what you have. That German phrase, Glück im Winkel, happiness in a corner. You're happy with the things you've been given, whatever they may be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. You know, I tell my grad students, and I fear that it's patronizing, but I feel it nonetheless, that that it's not, you want to publish your book, and we hope you'll publish your book, and we'll be very excited, if and when you publish your book. But it's not going to change your life.
Yeah.
Then you're going to have to move on to the next book.
Yeah, I think that's mostly true. I think it will not change your life fundamentally. It may change briefly the way people treat you.
And that can be dangerous.
It can be very dangerous. Yeah.
Do you think it gets any easier? I mean, I know a lot of people who feel like the second novel is the hardest one.
It was for me. And it is for a lot of people. I don't know whether it gets easier. Eventually, you kind of relax into a mode. And instead of thinking about sales, maybe you should worry about it, but I haven't. I've also been very lucky in the editors I've had. And they have helped me be more or less content with just working, having a book published, and then going on to the next thing. If you're a writer, that's what you do.
Right. I'm wondering if you feel the same way. The best time is when you're writing, not when the book is about to come out.
Absolutely, absolutely. As long as you are happy with whatever you're able to do. Maybe you have one morning and you've written a good sentence and you think, well, I wrote a good sentence this morning, or you wrote a good paragraph. And while you were writing it, you were giving yourself over to the characters, to the scene, to whatever the novel was about. You weren't thinking about yourself. You weren't thinking about whether you were going to make a lot of money from it. And I think at times like that, nobody is luckier than you are. Just to be in that place and to be writing, and the act of giving yourself over to the story. I try to practice humility before the story. The story is what's important. I'm not. I'm just trying to get it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I have my own theories about this, but I'm wondering why writerly insecurity doesn't go away. Michael Cunningham talks about after The Hours won the Pulitzer that he went into a big depression, and that makes sense to me in some ways. And
yeah, it doesn't go away if there's somebody who is doing better than you are. And the trouble is that somebody is always doing better than you are. Somebody is getting more of the prizes, somebody's getting more money, somebody's sales are better, somebody's name is in the paper along with their photograph, and if you allow these things to torment you, they will.
Yeah, I completely agree. I would even say it even more strongly, which is that even if there isn't someone who's doing well, I don't want to spend too much time on Donald Trump, certainly in terms of according him the sympathy of taking his emotional life seriously. But I think it's fair to say, in an armchair sort of way, that he seems like a pretty unhappy guy. And this is a guy who, for 4 years, was the most powerful person in the world.
Yeah.
And so it does make me feel like if you're doing this for a goal, that you cannot be satisfied, even if you are the most famous, the most photographed, the most anything.
Yeah. If I weren't here, I would be watching the hearings tonight. The other thing about Trump, or people like Trump who seem to be happy, is that, and this is something I've been thinking about recently, they just don't need literature. They have no use for it. And when they're confronted with it, they often are hostile or angry, or they say, I don't have the time to read fiction. I don't understand what fiction is about. And you begin to understand that lives like that They're not all bad, but the kind of empathy that we practice as readers and writers is simply not part of their way of being in the world.
Yeah, I agree. I have not a different theory, but an additional theory that I think relates to this. I've had readers ask me, like, which of your books, talking to me, is your favorite? And I think it's a horrible question, and I avoid it. But I think one of the reasons that I feel like it's a horrible question is because, and I don't know if you experience this, is that I can't remember the feeling. Once I'm done writing a book, I don't go back. I would never go back to it. And I don't know if you've seen the sci-fi show on Apple, Severance.
I haven't seen
But
it.
yeah, the premise is that they do some procedure on the character's brain such that they can't remember their work lives when they're at home, when they're outside of the office. And I kind of feel that in a certain way we all have a certain severance experience. Like, I think if someone showed me a book I wrote and I read it and I didn't remember having written it, I'd be like, yeah, that's possible. That sounds like me.
Yeah.
It's possible I wrote that book. Whereas if I read, Infinite Jest, I would say, no, that doesn't sound like me. And I'm not knocking Infinite Jest. I just think that doesn't sound like me.
Right.
But I wonder if that's part of the issue, is that you can't really remember the actual writing. And so when you get to the new book, part of what you're doing is you feel like you've never done it before, even though you kind of know you sort of have done it before.
What you're saying is very interesting to me for a number of reasons. If it is true that you generally can't remember the act of writing a book after the book is over, and I think that is true. I mean, it's true for me. It suggests that much of the time while we're working very hard on these books of ours, part of our work is dreaming. And you tend to forget the work you've done on a book, and in some sense may forget some of the contents of the book because it comes out of the same part of the mind that a dream does. In Wonderlands, I mentioned there's a very short passage in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina about the painter Mikhailov. Mikhailov is a very minor character, but he's been brought in to do a portrait of Anna, and he labors over this painting, and then when it's done, he can't remember having worked on it, and which is, for me, very true to my experiences of writing. And for that reason, I don't feel a sense of pride in what I've imagined. The only thing I can take pride in is that I sat down day after day to do it.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I mean, when someone says to me, "Oh, I liked your book," I think I like the feeling of being told something nice, like someone saying,
Yeah.
"I like you," or "You're a nice person," or "You're smart."
Right.
But I feel very disconnected from the actual
Oh, yeah.
product. And it reminds me a little bit. I think Joyce Carol Oates once said that she believes that whatever she's writing at the moment is the best thing she's ever written, which for someone like Oates is chutzpah, because she's written more books than some people have read. But I think what she's saying is that the only book that matters is what she's writing at the moment, because she doesn't remember writing anything else.
I was talking to a writer friend today, Chris Bram, a wonderful writer of fiction, and I said to him that we were both trying to think of a name of an actor. Turned out to be Mark Rylance. But we were both amused by the fact that we couldn't think of the name. And I said to him that I think that when your mind is trying to retrieve a name, that it is functioning in a way that is analogous to the way the mind is at work on a novel. That both the conscious and the unconscious mind are trying to solve the problems that you've set yourself up with. And it's true that craft matters can help us, particularly in revision. But I think much of the time when you're sitting down and you're writing either by hand or you're working at the computer, and I don't mean to belabor this idea, part of your mind is in something like a dream state.
Yeah, for sure. And I want us to talk, I'd love us to talk more about a dream state in a moment. I wonder if we might transition first briefly and talk a little bit. I want to actually read a quote from a student of yours, Emily Sinclair, in a letter that she wrote you. Because previously we're talking about insecurity in general, and I'm wondering about sort of the insecurity of writing specifically today in a Trump era or post-Trump era, in a global climate crisis era. So this is from a letter that Emily wrote to you. All of a sudden, post-election of Trump, the problems of rich white people 50 years ago seemed irrelevant. To be Balzac seems indefensible, frivolous, a relic of a time when we had the luxury of examining the social order. And I even wonder about Chekhov. What role does quiet and individual despair have in times like these? I recall my sense during my essay of Edith Wharton that she was busily and conflictedly serving up and defending New York society at the advent of the First World War, and how backward-looking she seemed to me, how blind to her own conflicts, how studiously irrelevant the question of one's carriage parked outside the opera is at such times. But here we are, still reading her, reading them all, and they do matter, but I can't quite tell how. And I think you really eloquently in this essay sort of addressed that question. But I'm wondering, if we could talk a little bit about sort of the specific challenges, personally and aesthetically, writing today. Because I know I feel them. I feel differently today than I did 10 years ago being a writer.
I think there are a lot of answers to that question, obviously. And I'll begin with two that I answered Emily with. The first thing I wrote to her to say was that Trump was dominating all of our lives and thoughts, and do we really want that to be the case? Do we want to spend all day having to think about him? And for me, the answer is certainly not. You want to be somewhere else, which means that one of the things that fiction can do for us is to provide a kind of refuge and a model for the way people behave. I think that's one of the reasons children love to read stories. The stories are giving them a model for how people behave when they're in some kind of crisis. The other thing that I said to her was that it is true that Edith Wharton's fiction may seem distant from us, but if you open up, let's say, a book like The House of Mirth, and you begin to read about how Lily Barth, step by step loses her standing in New York society and is destroyed as a human being, you're learning something about the very world that Trump inhabits. You're learning about it the way it was 100 years ago, maybe, but you've still got a model for what people do when someone is on a downward slope. And for me, that's a great comfort. It's a great comfort. And I don't feel when I'm reading fiction that I'm wasting my time. In the first place, I'm enjoying myself. And in the second place, I feel as if in the fiction I love, I always feel as if I'm learning about what people do.
Absolutely. I wonder about this issue on a kind of practical level. I think that, I think one of the reasons that sometimes people feel tempted to write work that doesn't take place in the world as we know it is because the world as we know it is outstripping the fictional world and competing with it.
Yeah.
So that, how do you set a book in 2017 when you don't want it to be about Trump? Right. Or, how do you set a book in September 2001 when you don't want to be about, or how do you set a book during COVID when you don't want it to be about COVID?
Well, I've struggled with this problem, and this new book of mine is called Wonderlands, because it seemed to me, and this was actually before Trump, but Trump exacerbated it, that the world that we were inhabiting was beginning to feel not, this is going to sound like a strange thing to say, but it didn't feel like realism anymore. I felt that the lives we were leading under Trump and with the pandemic was closer to a kind of fevered, hyper, I'm struggling for, I should be able to say what it is, but a visionary life in almost the worst sense. Somebody in one of my classes asked me whether I felt that realism was still viable as a mode. And what I said was that I think that realism works just fine when there's a general agreement about what reality is. And when there's no general agreement about what reality is, and when different versions of reality, some of them hallucinatory, are vying with facts, realism may not be, straight realism, I guess I would call it, it may not be up to the task.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I want to talk about that, because one of the things that really struck me in that essay about dreams that you referred to before has to do with, and this comes up, you know, I think there are people in the audience, I know there are people in the audience who have taught workshops and have been in workshops. So anyone who's been in a writing workshop knows that the question of plausibility comes up all the time, not always to the most beneficial effect. And so someone will say, well, that's not possible because people don't do that. And someone else says, well, it is possible because it happened to me. And, you know, the discussion devolves from there. And I think about what James Wood says about, you know, better a convincing implausibility than an unconvincing plausibility. And one of the things that you write in this essay, which I think is so interesting, is that you basically like call into question the notion of what, you're like, what is realism? I mean, you make the argument, you know, is Gatsby realist? I mean, most people think of it as a realist, but you're saying it actually, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but why don't you?
Sure. That's fine. That certainly there are passages in Gatsby, like Nick's introduction into the room where Daisy Buchanan is written in really a kind of hallucinatory way. My feeling about this is that plausibility is one of those terms that people throw around in workshops quite often, but that in actual practice, particularly with sort of visionary art, it just never seems to come up. And the example that I used in the book was Alfred Hitchcock's movie Vertigo, which David Thompson has written about, and apparently in a survey a few years ago it was named the #1 movie of all time. I don't think it is, but it's interesting to me because Vertigo, viewed from a distance, is absolutely preposterous. It's absolutely preposterous, and when I saw it with my mother in 1959, I was 12 years old, and my mother kept making this noise because she didn't believe a word of it. Now, I think Vertigo appeals to viewers who have invested in this, in an aspect of the story that includes a wish. And if a story is operating a con, Joan Silber and I have talked about this. If a story is operating a con, the reader is not going to bother with plausibility if the con is strong enough for the reader to want to believe it, if it enacts a wish of some kind. The wish in Vertigo being that if you might be able to bring somebody back to life if you found the right person and recostumed. It's a very perverse story, but I think it enacts a wish. And so people who go to that movie, except for my mother, just ignore. Just ignore how preposterous it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you about that. And I mean, one thing I'd want to press a little further on is sort of, because we all have an experience of reading a piece of fiction where we're like, don't believe it. Yeah. And then the writer we're working with might say, well, why not?
Yeah.
And I guess, and I was interested in this Patricia Hampl quote. Let me see if I can find it here.
She says it has to, the sentences have to bring you into a kind of spell. If the sentences aren't spellbinding, I'm paraphrasing here, if the sentences aren't spellbinding, then the plausibility problem is going to become larger and larger. If you just have serviceable prose, then it's going to be much more likely that the reader is going to say, I don't believe this.
Right. I mean, I completely agree with that. I guess I would say even more. I think there can be good, I'm not sure it's just serviceable prose. I think there can be good prose that isn't doing what the story wants it to do to make you believe. I mean, as soon as I read what you said about Gatsby and I read that Patricia Hampl quote, I immediately thought of a story that I teach in our craft class. I don't know if you know this story. It came out like 30 plus years ago by Ralph Lombriglia called Men Underwater.
I've read it, but I don't remember.
So it's in some ways a story that would seem completely realist.
Yeah.
It takes place in suburban Cleveland. There are swimming pools. There are two guys who work for a plumbing company, one of whom is a passive character, the other of whom wants to write screenplays. We don't see the screenplays, but we get his ideas for screenplays, and you have a pretty clear sense that he's a horrible screenplay writer. Within 24 hours, movie producers show up to suburban Cleveland with a lot of money for his movie.
Yeah.
And I think the story works, even though it's preposterous. And so I went back and I just want to read a passage, and I'm just curious to get your thoughts on it, because this is how the narrator describes the sort of movie-aspiring plumber, whose name is Gunther. Lately, I spent more hours of each week with Gunther than I spent with my wife. And still there are times, this moment is one of them, when I see him as I saw him the day we met. Times when I cannot get beyond the amazing epidermal surface of the man. Gunther is one of the largest people I've ever known, but it's more than that, more than his general enormousness, the smooth expanse of his completely bald head, the perfect beardlessness of his broad face. Gunther has no eyebrows, no body hair whatsoever as far as I know. Even the large nostrils of his great wide nose are pink, hairless tunnels running up into his skull. His velour pullover is open to his sternum, and the exposed chest is precisely the complexion of all the rest of him, the shrimp-like color of new Play-Doh, the substance from which Gunther sometimes seems to be made.
It's a great description. And one of the things that's noticeable about it, just as you're reading it, is that there is a series of compound complex sentences, so much so that you're kind of lulled into the description of Gunther with those small details. And you lose yourself in a description like that. You're so busy moving from one detail, one adjective to another, that you really don't have very much distance, I don't think, on what's going on in the story. I have a chapter in this book called Lush Life. I have a sentence from Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano that is very much like that one. You just lose yourself in sentences like this. Plausibility, who cares? Right? Who cares? The prose is moving forward, and whatever is in reality is moving backward, and it's the words in the sentences that you're registering.
Right. Yeah, and another thing I loved about this essay specifically was the way you kind of broke down this dichotomy between realism and call it surrealism or speculative work. Because as you say, you know, is Gatsby realist? Maybe, but maybe not. But I think it's also true that, you know, I mean, is the metamorphosis speculative? I mean, on some level it is, because we don't all turn into cockroaches, but there are other things in that book. Yeah. I mean, there are houses, gravity works, you know, there are bosses.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. I do think that if you look at some of the great classics of our literature and just run through a plot summary, you'd say, this is preposterous. I feel that way about Gatsby, you know, with the arrangement of who's in what car and what happens in the conclusion of that novel. Sigrid Nunez has written extensively about Gatsby and how preposterous she thinks it is. You don't notice that if the sentences are foregrounded.
I agree. You know, before we run out of time, I want to turn to something else, and I want to read a quote from another one of your essays, because it sort of harks back to a conversation you and I were having on email that I really want us to be able to talk a little about. And it's from your essay, Captain Happen. And the quote is, moderate unhappiness is not in itself a story. It's a condition. Irritation is a condition, but rage is a story. Rage produces action and pushes events through a one-way gate. Irritation pushes nothing much of anywhere.
Yeah.
Can you?
Yeah. A former student of mine, who's now a friend, Matt Burgess, and I were talking about what some of the features are in fiction that lend themselves to urgency and momentum. And I had been in the class that he had taken, and it was on plot and some of the mechanics of suspense. And among the devices that I had come up with, just to clarify my own thinking and perhaps theirs, was this figure, Captain Happen. Captain Happen is the person in your story who makes things happen. He's the volatile character, the person who will say things or do things that nobody else in the story will say or do. I think that as writers, we are very often afraid of rage and misbehavior and criminality and people shouting, and in workshops people say, oh, it's melodramatic. But in fact, I think that rage is an interesting state because it often leads to action that changes the whole situation. And the way I've been talking about this in my classes, I don't think this idea is original with me, is the one-way gate. A character, let's say in a state of rage, does something that, having been enacted, means that the character cannot get back to where he, she, or they were before that action was taken. I mean, the example I kept using with my students was Macbeth. Macbeth is one kind of person before he kills King Duncan. After he has committed that murder, he's somebody else, and he can't get back to where he was. Once you've committed a murder, there's no going back. And Macbeth says at one point in the play, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm up to my elbows in blood. The only way to go is forward. I cannot go back.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think I agree completely, and I think this idea of action and never going back kind of dovetails nicely with your first essay in Burning Down the House, which you and I have talked about, and we communicated after Parul Segal wrote in the New Yorker about trauma narratives, and I was in communication with Parul Segal, and so we kind of had a three-way conversation about that. And I just want to, I want to read the Marilyn Robinson quote from that essay, because I sometimes think that if I could just tear that essay out of the book and paste it to my forehead and sit in workshop, that I wouldn't have to do anything more. And so the quote that Charlie brings from Marilyn Robinson, is about a dirty little myth. And this is the dirty little myth.
She calls it
right.
a mean little myth.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
One is born and in passage through childhood suffers some grave harm. Subsequent good fortune is meaningless because of this injury, while subsequent misfortune is highly significant because of this injury. The work of one's life is to discover and name the harm one has suffered.
Yeah. That's the trauma narrative. And we have all, there's some great trauma narratives and some not so great trauma narratives. I have lately become, I guess, equally interested in what amounts to the reverse of the trauma narrative, not the narrative of terrible things that have been done to you, but terrible things that you have done and have kept secret, because there's no one to whom you can tell them except maybe the reader. And I think of these things as being toxic narratives. And the typical toxic narrative has a very odd sort of emotional and even spiritual quality, which is that if you're holding something in and you can't tell anyone, something like what I would call fugitive subjectivity takes over. The subjectivity that is inside, that is not expressed, goes out into the world, and what you end up with are what I would call haunted narratives. The subjectivity invades the house, it invades the atmosphere of the story. I'm very interested in trauma narratives, but I found myself equally interested, maybe also because of Trump, in narratives that are toxic. Clearly, the idea that he lost the election is a toxic narrative. He cannot tolerate that. And that's a kind of interesting situation for storytellers. There's a wonderful Alice Munro story called Child's Play, which is entirely about this, about a story that the narrator can tell no one except implicitly the reader, and the great harm that it does her.
Yeah.
I wonder, I have my eye on my watch, whether there are questions.
Yeah, so if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and Grace will come over with a microphone so you can ask it.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, is this on? Yeah, cool. Hello. I really enjoyed reading the chapters so far that I have, and I wanted to ask a little bit deeper beyond the text and the conversation so far about spellbinding through literature. And like an example, so like you read something like Aminadab, and it's very intellectually stimulating, and you read something like The Brothers Karamazov or Harry Potter, and it's a vivid dream. You see everything in your mind like it's a projection. And what are the different spells you think that we're casting on our readers, the connections we're creating with them, and talking a little bit about the style that you use?
It's a great question, and I think there are at least 2 or 3 levels to the spell that is being cast. One clearly is cognitive, and in, let's say, The Brothers Karamazov, the example that you gave, when Ivan Karamazov is talking about having to accept the suffering of children as the ticket to the meaning of the universe. And Ivan says, if that's what I am required to accept as the key to the universe, I refuse the ticket. For me, that's cognitive and emotional. But there's also the kind of spell casting that great prose can put us into. It's the kind of prose, and I'm trying to think of some examples. And maybe Gabriel Garcia Marquez would be an example, Toni Morrison being another, where you almost lose sight of what the subject matter is because the sentences are so beautiful. I do think sometimes that the spells that literature can cast on us can be dangerous. It depends on what use the spell is being put to. I'm not saying this well, but I can think of certain kinds of books where, and maybe the novels of Sir Walter Scott, where you're being introduced to ideas of chivalry, and that these are not good ideas. The way they're being put in those novels. That's the best answer I can give to you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm in the middle of your essay on melodrama from Burning Down the House.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm interested in the idea that you're talking about one of the uses of melodrama is the conflict between articulate malevolence and like the inarticulate suffering. And that essay is from 20-something years ago. Mm-hmm. I feel like now a lot of the time it feels like we're living in an era of totally incoherent malevolence that still is somehow in a position of power.
Right.
I'm curious if your ideas about melodrama and its uses have like changed over the course of that, like what feels to me at least like an increasing rise of incoherent malevolence.
Yeah. At the time that I wrote that essay, I felt that melodrama had gotten a kind of bad rap. And I had noticed that in my own workshops, when the materials of the story rose in dramatic tension, there was often a chance that somebody in the class would say, oh, this is melodramatic. And what bothered me about that was that it wasn't clear to me that anybody actually had a clear idea of what melodrama was, or the kinds of elements that go to work in melodrama. There has been a fair amount of academic criticism that has tried to retrieve melodrama as a politically progressive mode. And I think that's very interesting. One of the features of melodrama is that within it, evil which is perpetrated is not entirely explained. It simply is. And its origin is unclear. And I think that to some degree, although I understand the arguments against that mode, I think we often do feel in life that when people are doing great harm, that sometimes explanations are inadequate. That if you begin with the psychological explanations, the sociological explanations, yes, all right, fine, but there's something else. And that something else, the thing that is almost impossible to paraphrase is figured in melodrama. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for this book and Burning Down the House. I think you've given writers so much. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, I find it really interesting that, coming from that PhD academic space and then going in and saying, I've kind of taught myself how to be in workshop, which is really interesting. And then, I don't know if these were commissioned or you started writing them for magazines or how these essays kind of evolved out of you. But is there still some kind of like autodidact in you that's still kind of trying to solve the sort of that critical, crafty part of your brain?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Thank you all for your questions. I've been reading Elif Batuman's Either Or. And in the course of that book, one of the things that she says is that she doesn't like craft essays because they don't seem to have anything to do with the way people actually live their lives. And I've tried in the craft essays that are in Wonderlands and to some degree in Burning Down the House, these essays arise because of some human problem I'm trying to solve, or some element of human behavior that I think has some relation to the way we write stories. The example that I can give you, the first essay in the book is called The Request Moment. And I can tell you that when I was growing up, my mother was quite bossy. I would get home from school. The first thing that she would say to me is, "There's something I want you to do." And so this phrase was just burned into me. And I happened in Minneapolis to see 3 Shakespeare tragedies, more or less in a row, Macbeth, Hamlet, and King Lear. And what I noticed about them was that all 3 plays begin with a request moment from Hamlet's father to the ghost of Hamlet's father to Hamlet, Lady Macbeth's essentially her request to Macbeth, and so on. I think craft essays are useful for me for myself as a writer only if they touch on something having to do with our experience as we live it and the way that experience is figured in the fiction that we write. So generally, these essays begin and end with autobiography. And they move into some problem related to writing and then move out of it back into my life.
We have time for one more question.
Hi. This is maybe I feel a little bad asking this question because I haven't read the book yet, but I just wanted to ask, because the first passage that was read from your book was talking about Dark Night of the Soul, and again, this is a selfish question because I did my grad class on structure and story. Whether any of your essays touches on the 7 Essene mirrors as a use of structure. Was that the intention of that reference?
I didn't catch it either.
I'm losing my hearing, unfortunately.
I talk so fast. I'm so sorry. the 7 Essene mirrors, as if you've thought about that at all in terms of structure, story structure.
Something mirrors.
Dark Night of the Soul is one of the 7 Essene mirrors. That's what I thought that was in reference to.
Oh.
Was that right or is that not right?
I'm not sure.
So you said something mirrors? I just say.
Yeah, this. it's like a spiritual theory. I thought that that's what you were referring to in the first essay where you're talking about trials and tribulations of a writer, young writer. I thought maybe you were talking about, the way we see ourselves in our lives. And I was wondering if that sort of if that was a craft concept that you were intending to touch on, those mirrors as a structural device in story.
Well, yes, to a degree, if I understand your question correctly. In that essay, I wanted to address what I think is the hardest time of any writer's life. And generally speaking, I think that's when you're writing your initial stories and novels, and you feel as if in some way you have discovered your vocation. And the discovery of your vocation is a very important moment. It means that you feel that you have perhaps discovered what you are meant to do on Earth. And the difficulty of writers trying to get a foothold often involves finding ways of tolerating the kind of criticism, often very harsh criticism, that you get, and also feeling that you have no one to blame but yourself, because no one told you to do this. It was entirely self-generated. It was what you wanted to do. Now, I also feel that dark nights of the soul are great fodder for fiction. Fiction thrives on that kind of moment in a person's life, as it thrives on any moment in which a person's character is being tested. And I do believe that the kinds of persistence that may be necessary in finding yourself as a writer is finally a test of character.
Thank you to you both for this wonderful conversation. Can we give another round of applause?
Thank you. Thank you, Brad. Thank you.